The air over RAF Shoreham in the late summer of 1940 was a damp, metallic tincture of sea salt, freshly cut grass, and the omnipresent scent of high-octane aviation fuel. It clung to everything: the gray brick of the dispersal hut, the wool of the uniforms, the skin of the young men waiting beneath the corrugated iron roof. They sat in folding chairs, their faces catching the oblique, watery light of the pre-dawn. This was the stillness before the scream, the oppressive quiet that promised violence. Among them was Pilot Officer Alistair "Ali" Vance, 19 years old, and already bearing the weight of a generation. He was technically a man, yet his frame was still thin, his movements jerky with the nervousness of youth attempting to mimic the stoicism of his seniors. Ali's uniform felt too large, borrowed, a costume for a role he was not yet ready to play. Today was his first combat sortie. The reality of it was a cold, hard knot in his stomach that no amount of training could dissolve. He stared at his hands. They were clean, recently scrubbed, the nails trimmed, the hands of a boy who had spent the last 2 years reading textbooks and practicing smooth control inputs on a stationary training frame. In minutes, those hands would be responsible for the 5 tons of finely tuned aluminium and fire that was his Supermarine Spitfire Mki, a machine of impossible elegance and terrifying lethality. He kept repeating the checklist in his mind: a litany against fear, mixture rich. Prop fine. Flaps up. Radiator open. The words were a shield, a futile attempt to reduce the impending aerial ballet of death to a series of mechanical steps. He could feel the eyes of the veteran pilots on him, not unkindly, but with a detached pity. They knew the odds. They knew that on your first day, the sky either accepted you or rejected you, and rejection was final, brutal, and fast. The Spitfire, waiting on the perimeter, gleamed slightly in the rising light, an immaculate predator, but to Ali, it felt like an incredibly fast, highly flammable coffin. The briefing room was small, suffocating, and permeated by the stale scent of old cigarette smoke and freshly brewed, bitter tea. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows on the large map tacked to the wall, detailing the patrol line over the channel. Flight Lieutenant Davies, a man whose face looked decades older than his 24 years, traced a route with the point of a wooden pointer, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that betrayed his exhaustion. He spoke less about the strategy and more about the simple, fatal mechanics of the fight. Target is a recce flight, probably a couple of Dornier 17s. Expect cover. Heavy cover. We're going to be facing the new Staffel from Jägerschwader 51. The Messer pilots are fresh, aggressive, and they have the advantage of altitude and speed. He tapped the map sharply, a small sound that echoed loudly in the tense silence. They'll be flying the latest Bf-109-3S. Faster in the dive than we are, especially at high altitude. Our Mk can't touch them in a high-speed plunge. He looked directly at Ali, his eyes flat and devoid of emotion. Listen to this, Vance. This is your only lesson for today: don't follow the 109 down. You'll never catch him. And if he comes down on you, don't turn the same way twice. If you're low and fast, pull out. If you're high and slow, well, make your peace. The finality of the statement hung in the air, a tacit acknowledgement that the rules of engagement were written in blood, and they were, fundamentally, unfair. The briefing ended not with a rallying cry, but with a weary sigh. Ali walked across the damp grass to his aircraft, the weight of the parachute pack bulky and uncomfortable. The ground crew chief gave him a quick, silent thumbs up, a gesture of camaraderie that felt enormous in its significance. He climbed the short ladder, ducking under the canopy rail, and slid into the cockpit. The leather of the seat was cool and stiff, the aluminium controls immediately familiar yet profoundly strange. This machine was his partner, his prison, and his potential salvation. He strapped in, the heavy webbing pressing him firmly against the back armor plate. The scent in the cockpit was intense, a heady mix of engine oil, old hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, clean smell of the leather trim. He closed the canopy, a heavy, mechanical thunk, and the outside world instantly receded, becoming a distorted, distant view through the curved perspex. This was the moment of complete, terrible focus. He went through the sequence, priming the fuel pump, setting the ignition switches. He shouted, "Clear prop," more as a reflex than a necessity, and then pressed the starter button. The silence was obliterated. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine caught with a cough and a massive shudder. The four massive propeller blades dissolved into a shining disk. The sound was not a simple noise, it was a physical presence, a violent, deep-throated roar that vibrated through the airframe and into Ali's very bones. It was a rhythmic, pulsing drumbeat of enormous power, the sound of his fate. He watched the oil pressure needle climb, the RPM stabilize. He feathered the propeller pitch, feeling the immediate surge of energy through the stick. His hands, no longer those of a boy, but those of a pilot, rested lightly on the controls, accepting the awesome responsibility of the machine now alive beneath him. He focused on the smooth, rhythmic movement of the control surfaces during the check, left aileron up, right down, full rudder left, full right, a ritual of perfection designed to stave off the terrible imperfection of the war. They taxied out onto the grass runway, the Spitfires nosing into the light like a line of metal sharks. Ali followed the section leader, his gaze fixed on the Spitfire ahead, trying to mirror the veteran's movements. The green flare was fired, the signal for takeoff. He smoothly pushed the throttle fully forward. The Merlin roared, and the Spitfire surged, pressing him back into his seat with brutal force. The grass rushed past, a green blur, the control inputs becoming instinctual, a slight right rudder to counter the torque, the stick held neutrally. The moment of rotation was gentle, almost surprising. 1 second, the ground was a terrifying, solid threat, the next, the world had dropped away. He lifted the gear with a dull hydraulic whine and began the climb. The noise in the cockpit was overwhelming, but Ali was already in a new kind of silence, the silence of hyperfocus. Below, the English coastline receded, the neat farms, the tiny villages, the chalk cliffs, all the precious, vulnerable normality he was ascending to defend. The climb was relentless, a long, slow ascent into the cobalt blue void. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin, cold, and utterly clear. The sun was an aggressive, blinding disk, and the sky was a canvas of endless, quiet potential. The radio was a faint, intermittent crackle in his ears, translating the voices of his flight leader and the ground controller into clipped, confusing instructions. The coldness seeped into the cockpit, a physical reminder of the altitude and the danger. Ali adjusted his oxygen mask, the rubber smelling faintly of antiseptic. He was alone, suspended between the earth and the sun, waiting for the violence to begin. The wait was the worst part. The patrol was routine, boring, until the radio suddenly shattered the silence. "Hello, Blue Section. Vectors 305, Angels 18. Bandits inbound. Looks like a 30+ of bombers and heavy escort. Get ready." The voice was calm, which only amplified the danger. Ali's breath hitched in his throat. 30+. That was more than a flight, it was a wall of metal. He craned his neck, straining against the confines of the cockpit. The vastness of the sky was now oppressive, a hiding place for killers. Then, he saw them. At first, they were nothing but minute, dark specks, like dust motes against the glittering horizon, catching the sun every few seconds. But they were moving, steadily, impossibly fast, growing larger with every second. The specks resolved into the aggressive, brutal shapes of Dornier bombers, flanked by the sleeker, deadly shapes of the Bf-109s. The leader's voice was firm, now urgent. "Tally-ho. Okay, Blue, we're going to hit the Dorniers hard. Blue leader on the left. Blue 2, take the right flank. Blue 3, Vance, stay tight on my wing. Do not get separated. We hit them hard, we break right, we get out." Ali acknowledged the command, his voice sounding thin and reedy to his own ears. The adrenaline surged, a hot, metallic taste in his mouth. The 4 Spitfires peeled into a gentle dive, gaining speed and momentum. The beauty of the formation was deadly. They were not simply flying, they were hunting, a coordinated, metallic fist punching into the German formation. The closing speed was staggering. One moment, the enemy was distant, the next, the black crosses on the wings were huge, filling the canopy. The sight of the German gunners, tiny figures behind the rotating barrels of their defensive weapons, was momentarily paralyzing. Ali had to force his hand forward, pressing the spade grip firing button. The sound of his own guns firing was a visceral shock, a rapid, chattering roar of machine guns and the deeper thump-thump of the cannon, vibrating the entire airframe. The smell of cordite, acrid and sharp, instantly filled the cockpit. He held the button down, aiming for the fuselage of the nearest Dornier, but his aim was clumsy, too high, a nervous burst. Tracer rounds, glowing lines of deadly light, streaked past his wings from the German gunners. His flight leader's guns were more accurate. The Dornier they were attacking began to trail a thin, black plume of smoke from its port engine, a sure sign of a hit. Then, everything dissolved into a terrifying, three-dimensional melee. Spitfires and Messerschmitts were corkscrewing and diving around the bombers. A Bf-109 suddenly flashed across Ali's nose, its angular shape cutting the light. He yanked the stick, trying to bring his own guns to bear, losing sight of his leader, exactly what he had been warned against. The world became a confusing, whirling blur of sky, cloud, and flashing metal. Ali was alone. The Dornier he was chasing began to spiral down, a victory he barely registered. His attention was now solely focused on the immediate threat. He was preoccupied with scanning the sky ahead, forgetting the cardinal rule of survival: look behind you. It was the flash of sunlight that saved him, momentarily catching the polished aluminium of a wingtip. He snapped his head around, his heart vaulting into his throat. A Messerschmitt Bf-109-3 was there, sitting directly on his tail, impossibly close, a dark, aggressive silhouette filling his rearview mirror. The German pilot, Hauptmann Klaus, was a hunter of long experience, utilizing the high-speed dive and the sun as his advantage. He was perfectly positioned. Klaus's gun spat fire. Ali heard the impact before he felt it, a series of sharp, metallic thwack-thwack-thwack sounds as the 20mm cannon shells found the Spitfire's rear fuselage. They were not subtle sounds, they were percussive, brutal knocks against the armor plate, cutting through the engine noise. The control column suddenly felt different, less responsive. A thick, noxious smell, hot oil and ozone, began to seep from the damaged rear section. Ali instinctively wrenched the stick to the left and slammed the rudder, attempting the standard, high-G evasive turn taught in every training manual. Ali pulled hard on the stick, the G-forces immediately crushing him deep into his seat. His vision began to gray out at the edges, a familiar warning sign. The Spitfire, a marvel of maneuverability, responded instantly, snapping into a tight, screaming turn. His heart hammered a brutal rhythm against his ribs. He's coming off. He'll have to overshoot, he thought, reciting the training mantra. But Klaus was not a rookie. He had anticipated the turn. He tightened his own turn instantly, showing a superior understanding of energy management and positioning. He was using the superior roll rate of the Spitfire against it, cutting the corner. Through the blur of the turn, Ali saw the 109 again, still frighteningly close, closing the gap. The grey-out deepened, the centrifugal forces pressing him forward, making it hard to breathe. The German was winning. He wasn't gaining ground slowly, he was closing with brutal, geometric certainty. The metallic knocks on the fuselage resumed, closer this time, one of the rounds tearing a ragged hole through the fabric of the wing root. Ali realized the terrifying truth: the standard evasive maneuver was failing. His training was going to cost him his life. He was losing altitude fast, and the 109 pilot was perfectly positioned for the final, fatal burst. He was trapped in a predictable, descending spiral towards the sea. The second stretched into an eternity. Ali could see the glint of the 109's propeller hub, the black cross on the wingtip, the terrifying certainty of the German pilot's lethal intent. The fear was no longer a knot in his stomach, it was a physical scream in his head. I am going to die. I am going to die. His mind, overwhelmed by the sensory input and the failing maneuver, simply shattered. He broke the cardinal rule, he looked not at the enemy, but at the ground, rushing up to meet him. In a final, desperate, training-shattering moment of pure survival instinct, a violent rejection of the incoming fire, he didn't pull back on the stick. Instead, he slammed the stick fully forward. This was an act of complete panic, an attempted escape from the bullets by diving away from them, aiming for the ground. The sudden negative G pushed him violently up against the straps. His entire body lifted momentarily from the seat, an intensely disorienting sensation of lightness, followed by the sickening, rushing speed of the uncontrolled dive. He then slammed the rudder and yanked the stick back, attempting to initiate an outside loop, an acrobatic, impossible feat designed to regain control, but which, at this speed and angle, should have torn the wings off the aircraft. He had lost control completely, his inputs were random, frantic, and potentially fatal. What followed was not a controlled maneuver, but a chaotic dance of physics. The negative G push, followed by the rapid aileron input, snapped the Spitfire into a half-roll, instantly ending up inverted. Ali was hanging from his straps, the world turned upside down. The sea and the coast were above his head, a sheet of blue and white that defied logic. He was plummeting. The ground was rushing up at terminal velocity. His vision was spinning, and the nausea was immediate and debilitating. His desperate, final input, the violent, massive pullback on the stick to save himself from the impending crash, forced the aircraft through the vertical axis. Instead of an outside loop or a spin, the combined inputs resulted in a perfect, if violently executed, half-roll followed by a sustained, terrifying vertical plunge that bled off all vertical energy, converting it into immense forward speed. He had, accidentally, initiated the fundamental elements of what would later become known as the split S, a half-roll into an inverted, full-power dive, followed by an immediate pull-out. It was a move that traded all altitude for speed and an instantaneous 180-degree change in vector, a move of utter desperation that was fundamentally contrary to all accepted combat doctrine. Hauptmann Klaus, a methodical and lethal pilot, was stunned. He had the young Englishman perfectly lined up, his sights steady, his finger tightening on the trigger. The Spitfire was in its final, predictable turn. Then, it simply defied him. Instead of crashing or spinning, the British fighter suddenly pushed over, then snapped upside down, accelerating vertically into a nose-down plummet. Klaus had never seen anything like it. It was not a controlled dive, it was too fast, too violent. It appeared to be a suicide dive, a catastrophic loss of control caused by the extreme forces of the high G turn combined with the incoming fire. It was the absolute, final, desperate reaction of a broken man. He spun in, Klaus muttered to himself in German, his finger releasing the trigger. He had to react instantly. He could not follow the vertical plunge, his Bf-109's early fuel injection system suffered from fuel cutout during sustained negative G maneuvers, and the extreme vertical dive would put his own aircraft under dangerous stress. He watched the Spitfire disappear, a black speck rushing towards the sea, then vanishing low over the landscape. Klaus assumed the young pilot had either crashed into the ground or was about to. He broke off the attack, pulling his 109 back up into the fight, logging the incident as an unconfirmed but certain kill. He was focused on the greater battle, the vanishing plane was simply an anomaly, a fluke of pilot error under pressure. Ali pulled back on the stick with all his strength, fighting the massive G-forces, now positive, as the Spitfire desperately tried to claw its way out of the vertical descent. The pressure was enormous, crushing him back into his seat, forcing the blood from his head. His vision tunneled into a tiny gray pinhole. He tasted bile and was utterly disoriented. The Spitfire screamed out of the dive mere feet above the green fields of the English countryside. The velocity was terrifying. The hedge rose, the tiny streams, the individual trees rushed past at impossible speeds, a green and brown blur. The nose lifted, the forces subsided, and his vision returned in a flood of color and light, accompanied by a wave of nausea. He was alive. He was fast, too fast, skimming the deck, the aircraft vibrating with the stresses of the impossible maneuver. He leveled out, his hands shaking so violently that he had to physically force them to remain still on the controls. The air was thick and heavy at this altitude, and the thump of the low-level air pockets hitting the wheels was a constant, jarring reminder of his terrifying proximity to the earth. The sound of the engine, though still a thunderous roar, now seemed a welcome noise, a confirmation of life. The terror of the last 40 seconds had left him physically and emotionally drained, a wreck of a pilot flying a heavily stressed machine, but he was alive. The flight back to Shoreham was a blur of silence and pain. The world was utterly calm now, the battle long over. Ali was alone in his crippled machine, focused only on the difficult task of landing. The Spitfire felt damaged, heavy, and unresponsive. The smell of scorched metal and hydraulic fluid was stronger now, a constant reminder of how close he had come. He nursed the aircraft home, dropping the wheels and flaps with a smooth, almost gentle touch that belied the chaos of his encounter. The touchdown was Ginger, the Spitfire bouncing lightly before settling onto the grass. He cut the engine, and the terrifying, beautiful roar was replaced by an absolute, intense silence, broken only by the sharp, metallic tink-tink-tink of the hot engine cooling. The ground crew rushed over. The flight sergeant, his face grim, quickly began the damage assessment. Bullet holes were stitched across the fuselage, the rudder was visibly warped, and the tailplane showed stress fractures near the hinge points. Ali's helmet was lifted from his head. He was pale, shaking, and had a small cut above his eye, but he was standing. His first mission, and he had returned. The silence of the hangar was oppressive, the intensity of the fight replaced by the crushing exhaustion of survival. The debriefing was agonizing. Ali, still shaking and unable to hold his teacup steady, faced his flight commander in a small, cramped office. "What happened, Vance?" the flight commander asked, his pen poised over the combat report. "The 109 got on your tail. We heard you break away. You dropped out of the formation. Did you evade?" Ali tried to piece together the seconds of pure panic. I did the standard high G turn, sir, but he was better. He stayed with me. He was getting in short bursts. He swallowed hard. Then I pushed the stick forward, sir. I aimed for the deck. I thought if I went vertical, he'd have to break away or hit me. He omitted the half roll, the inverted flight, and the near blackout. It was too embarrassing, too close to admitting total loss of control. He couldn't articulate the random, desperate combination of controls. He simply said, "I recovered very low, sir." He must have lost sight of me. The flight commander frowned, skeptical. A desperate dive? You risked a spin for a simple evasion. He sighed, weary of the recklessness of young pilots. The 109 pilot reported a probable kill, a spin-in due to pilot error under fire. You were lucky, Vance. That wasn't a tactical move, that was desperation. Next time, stick to the book. The move was dismissed as a fluke, a lucky stall recovery under fire. Ali left the office frustrated. He knew it was more than luck, but he lacked the technical language to describe the terrifying, effective physics of his momentary lapse of control. Squadron leader Thomas was a veteran of the Great War, now grounded and serving as a kind of mechanical advisor, a pragmatic engineer disguised as a pilot. He was a quiet, observant man with hands that understood the intimate language of stressed aluminium. While the flight commander dismissed Ali's survival as luck, Thomas was down on the tarmac, examining the damaged Spitfire, running his gloved hands along the skin. He focused on the tailplane. The damage from the enemy cannon was clear, but it was the stress fractures in the metal around the stabilizer and the finely wrinkled aluminium skin near the control hinges that caught his eye. These were not the signs of a gentle dive and pull-out. They were indications of extreme and conflicting G-forces, a violent combination of negative G, the initial push forward, immediately followed by immense positive G, the pull-out. He looked at the wreckage of the machine and then at Ali, who was sitting miserably on a nearby bomb crate. "Pilot Officer Vance," Thomas asked, his voice low, "did you push over and then pull through the vertical, quickly?" Ali stared, surprised. "Yes, sir. I was aiming for the ground, trying to get away from his guns. I just yanked back to stop from hitting the deck." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind already churning the physics. The aircraft hadn't spun in. It had been pulled through the vertical axis in an impossible geometry. The negative G of the initial push, which would have momentarily disoriented the pursuing German, followed by the immense G-force of the pull-out. The aircraft had shed altitude with suicidal speed, but had also achieved a total, momentary break in the enemy's visual and firing line. The next morning, Thomas used the quiet time in the mess hall for an impromptu lesson. He chalked the sequence on a damp, battered blackboard, sketching the enemy aircraft and the path of the Spitfire. He traced the standard turn, then the point of failure. "Here," he said, tapping the board. "The 109 is still on him." Vance, in his desperation, pushes the stick forward. Negative G. The aircraft is momentarily inverted. Then, he pulls back, hard. Thomas sketched a severe, swooping arc that transitioned from an inverted flight path into a vertical descent, then leveled out. "It's a half roll into a dive," Thomas declared. But unlike a simple dive, the inverted entry and the immediate, steep pull-through is counterintuitive and violently fast. It puts the aircraft under incredible stress, but it also creates an instantaneous drop in the vertical plane, a sudden, massive change in direction that the pursuer is not expecting. He realized the potential. The move wasn't about fighting, it was about escaping. The enemy pilot assumes the aircraft is either spinning or suicidal. He hesitates. In air combat, hesitation is fatal, for the pursuer. Thomas mentally rehearsed the move, focusing on the critical timing of the half-roll and the need for altitude before initiating. He began to call it, tentatively, the inverted escape dive. Across the channel, the atmosphere at the Luftwaffe airfield was one of stark, efficient gloom. Hauptmann Klaus was completing his own post-mission report for his major, a man with a cold, unforgiving temperament. Klaus described the engagement with the young Spitfire pilot. "I was perfectly positioned, her major. He was turning conventionally, and I was closing for the kill. Then, the target, it broke off. It pushed over violently, inverted, and simply dropped." Klaus paused, frustrated. It was not a spin. It was too fast, too controlled in its initial movement. It simply plummeted out of the fight, pulling out very low over the terrain. "I could not follow due to the altitude and the risk of fuel cut out." The major scoffed. "A controlled crash? An attempt to bail out at low altitude? You allowed a damaged aircraft to escape, Hauptmann. We log it as an unconfirmed loss, pilot error. Your inexperience with the new British pilots is concerning." Klaus, a man of pride and skill, was deeply unnerved. The Spitfire hadn't fought him, it had simply vanished. He could not shake the image of the inverted, plummeting fighter. It felt less like a kill and more like a ghost slipping through his fingers. He logged the phenomenon as an unconfirmed aberration, a maneuver that broke all known rules of engagement. Squadron leader Thomas was not easily dismissed. He understood that the margins in air combat were so fine that a mere second of hesitation could change the outcome of a fight. Ali Vance's panic move had inadvertently bought that second. Thomas began to take up his own Spitfire 4 engine testing and high-altitude calibration flights over a deserted stretch of the channel, away from the prying eyes of the base and, more importantly, German reconnaissance. High above the white cloud layers, he started to practice the inverted half-roll and dive. The first attempts were as violent as Ali had described. The negative G was sickening, the massive, sustained pullout at the end was physically brutal. He fought the urge to black out, the immense positive G forcing the blood into his lower extremities. The key, he discovered, was the precise timing, a smooth, immediate transition from the half-roll into the vertical dive, maintaining full power to maximize the speed and vertical vector, and then pulling out only when the ground, or sea, became a certainty. It was a one-time escape move, a massive sacrifice of altitude for speed and an instantaneous, three-dimensional break in the line of sight. It required immense physical strength and unwavering nerve. Thomas mastered the control inputs, transforming the raw act of survival into a repeatable, if dangerous, tactical procedure. A week later, the squadron scrambled again. The weather was bright, the air thick with tension. Thomas was leading a section of 3. High over the Thames estuary, they engaged a large formation of Heinkel 111s escorted by a new wave of aggressive 109s. In the ensuing melee, Thomas found himself alone, with a pair of highly skilled 109s leveraging their altitude advantage to drop onto him. He broke right, then left, trying to bleed their energy, but the two German pilots were coordinated and efficient. He was rapidly losing ground, positioned beneath them in a classic defensive bind. This was the moment. He pushed the stick forward, initiating the negative G half-roll. The sensation was familiar, the straps momentarily holding him in the inverted cockpit. He slammed the stick back, pulling through the vertical. The Spitfire plunged, a metallic projectile, dropping out of the fight at tremendous speed. His pursuers were momentarily confused. Did he stall? Did he go into a spin? The sudden, vertical drop was not a recognized evasion. The lead 109 pilot hesitated for a crucial second, trying to calculate the vector. The other 109, trying to follow, saw his lead hesitate and broke off his own pursuit. Thomas pulled out of the dive, skimming the water, the spray momentarily clouding his canopy. He was a long way from the fight, but he was intact. He broke the engagement cleanly, forcing the German pilots to choose between continuing their pursuit into an unknown low-altitude game or returning to the high-altitude fight. They chose the latter, frustrated. The maneuver worked perfectly, not as a fighting move, but as a life-saving evasion. He had traded a massive amount of potential energy for kinetic energy and an instantaneous break in the enemy's attack. The pursuing Bf-109 pilot, unable to follow due to the limitations of his engine and the risk of crashing, simply pulled up and rejoined his partner. Thomas returned to Shoreham with a profound confidence. He had not only survived a 2-on-1 attack but had done so using the accidental move of his youngest pilot. The move was no longer a theory written on a chalkboard, it was a confirmed, lethal defensive weapon. He had the proof he needed to bring the doctrine to the rest of Fighter Command. The full squadron was assembled for the tactical briefing. Thomas stood before the map, his tone serious. He explained the maneuver, detailing the inputs, the immense G-forces, and the psychological impact on the pursuing German pilots. It is not a turning fight, Thomas explained, tracing the arc. It is a deliberate, violent, vertical escape. The initial negative G roll is counterintuitive and momentarily disorients the attacker. The vertical plunge forces them to break off, because their aircraft cannot sustain the pursuit. You gain speed, you break the line of sight, and you create distance. The pilots listened intently, understanding the sheer audacity of the move. One of the more experienced flight lieutenants, a man named Henderson known for his dry wit, raised his hand. Squadron leader, what are we calling this magnificent act of temporary insanity? The inverted dive sounds too academic. Thomas smiled faintly. We need a name that describes the motion. It's a half-roll followed by a dive and pull out. The geometry, sir, Henderson mused. It's splitting a full loop in half, ending up in a reverse direction at a much lower altitude. It's like a split S shape. The name stuck immediately. It was clean, descriptive, and memorable. The split S. The accidental, desperate survival move of a 19-year-old on his first mission had been codified, formalized, and christened with a name that would soon become one of the most critical evasive maneuvers in Allied air doctrine. Pilot Officer Ali Vance was initially mortified when he was called into the briefing room after Thomas's presentation. He feared he would be reprimanded again for his initial, panicked move. Instead, Thomas simply gestured to the chalkboard diagram of the split S. "Vance," Thomas said, his tone respectful. "This maneuver, this split S, was born on your first flight. You discovered it in a moment of pure survival. We have simply formalized the inputs. You are the originator, the man who, by accident, gave us a vital tool." Ali, still pale, looked at the diagram. He saw the physics of his near-death experience laid out in neat chalk lines. He was no longer the foolish boy who had lost control, he was the accidental architect of a life-saving tactic. There was no fanfare, no medal, just the quiet, immense pride of a young man realizing that his greatest failure had been the key to his survival and the potential survival of countless others. His raw, unthinking instinct had been distilled into doctrine. The split S was rapidly disseminated across fighter command. Training manuals were hastily updated, featuring a diagram of the half-roll and pull-through. It became the recommended emergency escape maneuver against the Bf-109, specifically targeting the German fighter's superior high-speed dive and its inherent fuel cutout issues during -G maneuvers. The effect was immediate and pronounced. The inexperienced pilots, like Ali, now had a definitive, planned response when a 109 latched onto their tail. It fundamentally changed the odds in the ongoing Battle of Britain. Pilots who had been written off as probable losses were returning to base, their aircraft stressed, their nerves shot, but intact. The German pilots, who had relied on the predictability of the standard evasive turn, suddenly found their targets performing impossible, vanishing acts. The Spitfire, already an exceptional aircraft, had gained a new layer of unpredictability. Back in his concrete bunker, Hauptmann Klaus pored over the increasing number of combat reports. Reports detailing Spitfires that, when cornered, simply disappeared vertically. The British were adopting a vanishing trick, a suicide dive that was proving devastatingly effective at breaking engagement. "They are not crashing, Herr Major," Klaus insisted, tapping a new report. 3 separate instances this week. They are initiating a high-speed dive, pulling immense speed, and breaking clean. It defies logic. They are sacrificing their altitude and energy, yes, but they are surviving. The tactic is unpredictable. The German commanders struggled to find a countermeasure. The Luftwaffe pilots were trained for speed and height advantage, and the split S forced them into a low-altitude pursuit, an area where the Spitfire was often superior in handling, or forced them to break off, allowing the damaged RAF fighter to escape. The psychological pressure mounted, the easy kills were no longer easy. The Allied pilots were learning to use fear as a weapon, transforming a moment of panic into a calculated, lethal escape. Weeks later, Ali Vance was flying again. The memory of his first mission was still vivid, but the fear had been replaced by a hardened, cold professionalism. He was no longer flying a machine, he was wielding a weapon. In a fierce dogfight over Dover, a 109 expertly maneuvered onto his tail. This time, Ali did not panic. He waited for the German pilot to commit, allowing the enemy to close the distance. He then executed the split S. It was no longer a frantic shove of the stick. It was a smooth, controlled half-roll, the horizon snapping cleanly above his head, followed by a sustained, powerful dive. The G-forces were intense, but he gritted his teeth, holding the input steady. He felt the immense strain on the airframe, but this time, he was in control. He plunged vertically, broke the German pilot's visual and radar lock, and pulled out clean, low over the channel. He climbed back up, rejoined his formation, and continued the fight. The terror of the first flight had been replaced by the tactical efficiency of a hardened professional. The move was now a tool, not an accident. The split S became a signature of Allied air combat. It was adapted and refined, used by American P-51 Mustang pilots over Germany and later by pilots in the Pacific Theater. It was a symbol of Allied flexibility, the ability to learn, adapt, and transform a moment of panic into a piece of life-saving doctrine. The simple, counterintuitive maneuver, the half-roll into the vertical dive, saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives across multiple fronts, ensuring that Allied pilots could break off a losing engagement and return to fight another day. It was the legacy of a young pilot who, on his first mission, had been closer to death than anyone should ever be. Decades passed. The young pilot officer Alastair Vance, now an elderly civilian, stood quietly in the hushed, cavernous hall of an air museum. He stood before a perfectly restored Spitfire Mki, the aircraft polished to a mirror sheen, mounted high on a pedestal. It was immaculate, silent, and entirely beautiful, a distant memory of a machine of death. He looked at the cockpit, remembering the confined space, the smell of avgas and ozone, the violent shudder of the Merlin engine. He touched the smooth, cool metal of the wing. He was often asked about his invention, the Split S. Historians lauded it as a brilliant piece of tactical genius. But Ali never talked about the genius. He spoke instead of the sheer, raw terror of that first flight, the complete collapse of his training, the moment when his mind simply screamed get away from the fire. He reflected that the world often praises the elegance of the outcome without remembering the brutal, messy desperation of the origin. He was the architect, yes, but the blueprint had been drawn in a moment of utter fear. The silence in the museum was a profound, heavy quiet, a stark contrast to the thunderous roar that had marked his entry into the war. The camera slowly pans away from the museum aircraft, lifting up and out toward the infinite, endless blue sky. War demands innovation, but it rarely allows for quiet contemplation. The final narration begins, slowly. The most sophisticated tactics are often not born on a drawing board or in a briefing room, but in a moment of pure, visceral panic. For pilot officer Alastair Vance, the Split S was not a strategy. It was the involuntary, desperate gasp of a young man fighting for his last breath, a final, reckless throw of the dice against an unbeatable opponent. Yet, that single moment of uncontrolled terror, refined by the cool logic of his superiors, gifted the Allies a vital piece of doctrine, a life-saving escape. The irony remains, the move that allowed pilots to escape a guaranteed death was conceived when a 19-year-old was staring death in the face, forgetting every single thing he had ever been taught. It is a testament to the primal power of the will to survive, proving that sometimes, in the dark, chaotic calculus of combat, the greatest breakthrough can be born from the greatest failure of control. Venezuela shocked. Fully armed elite U.S. Marines deployed directly to Margarita Island.